again through our skeletal muscles. So we're going to go through some of these examples. I think there's 5, yes. So I would expect you to be able to describe these 5, okay? And not all of them are going to be as simple as, wow, that's really a reflex? Well, yes, it is, technically, because of how it's built, because it's stereotyped, because it's uncontrollable, you don't have any control of it, it's considered a reflex, okay? The first is called a muscle spindle. Muscle spindle, okay? We have stretch receptors that are embedded or built into our muscles. So we can tell whether the muscle is contracted or not. The length of the muscle, the position to some degree of the muscle, at least as far as its overall length. Okay? And this is important because to get the coordinated contractions that lead to smooth muscle movements, we have to know how far they are stretched. We also have to build and maintain muscle tone involved in posture and various other things, and the only way to really know that, the brain to know that, is to have some sort of sensor that says the muscle is contracting. Okay? So this is called a muscle spindle. So coordinated movement, some sort of corrective reflexes, we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Muscle tone, posture, things like that are all done through a muscle spindle. Muscle stretch is one way to do it. So, but it's a little bit different than this next one. This is what we call the stretch reflex. And this is where muscles become stretched rather fast. So I'm going to show you what this means. So all of a sudden there's a change in the muscle length because something's pulling on it. Something physical. This is not something we're doing in our own body. It's just telling the brain, oh, we're in this position. This is something external to the body that's causing us to stretch. We have a stretch reflex. So we stretch our thigh muscles. If that sudden stretch occurs, there's a reflex. Now the best example of this is what we call the tendon reflex. So you've all done this in the doctor, right? You suspend your leg, you just hit right here in the patellar ligament, and you kick, right? Every single time. It's a nice way for the doctor to understand your central nervous system, and if it's functioning properly. If you don't do it right, you kick him in the head or you don't do it at all. I have no idea how he really determines it. He determines it, but through the not normal response, it could indicate that you have some sort of neurological problem. That's why they do that in the doctor's office. So that's called a stretch reflex. Well, how does that work? Wait a minute, man. How does that do that? Well, you hit the patellar ligament, and it's causing this muscle to stretch. Ever so little, but that's how that works. This is a stretch, and as soon as it's becoming stretched, this muscle, it contracts. So that's why you have that little kick. That little stretch that happens from hitting that right here causes the muscles right here to stretch, and that causes your leg to kick out. Call that a stretch reflex. Okay? The next two kind of go hand in hand, but I have to describe them separately. Okay? First one's called the flexor reflex, or some people call it the withdrawal reflex. Flexor reflex, and the second one's called the cross extension reflex. So let's go back to our example. We're walking along the ocean, right? And I step on a piece of glass. My response in my right leg that just stepped on the glass is to pull back, right? That's the first response. That's the first reflex. That's the withdrawal reflex. I withdraw my leg. But guess what happens? As soon as you do that, what do you have to do? What happens with this leg? If I don't do anything, if I just pull this leg up, I'm going to fall, right? This leg has to respond too, doesn't it? And you don't have time to think about it. This is a reflex. It's not going to the brain. You're not making a decision. Oh, I better put more weight on this leg. Oh, I better contract these muscles or I'm going to fall. No, it happens too fast. So we have to have a reflex that counteracts the first one. This leg goes up. This leg is going to support the weight. We'll have increasing muscle tension in the second leg. That's called the cross extension reflex. And that works on this leg. So it's a coordinated action, but it's considered two different reflexes. So withdrawal reflex, or what they call flexor reflex, and then cross extension. So we extend the other leg, basically, and we have muscle contractions for balance. The last reflex is to keep us from pulling the tendons off our own bones. Like, really? Yeah. So it is possible, at least without this reflex, that you could lift a very heavy object and literally rip the tendons off your bones. You can pull with such force, your muscles are that strong, that you could technically pull the tendons right off the bone, if you didn't have this working against you. This is the countermeasure that ensures that won't happen, at least usually. So we have sensors, nerve fibers that are actually along that tendon. And when the tension gets too strong, they feed back to the muscle that's not contracting as much. So you physically cannot contract your muscle strong enough to pull them off the bone, as long as it's functioning properly. It's called a tendon reflex. So it moderates the contraction. You don't rip it off the bone. Tendon off the bone. Good so far? The last couple things, we'll wrap this up, are just some diseases, what we call homeostatic imbalances. And you just need to know generally what these are. Okay? So spina bifida, spinal cord trauma, poliomyelitis. I won't even go through ALS other than just mentioning it, and shingles. Just mention that as well. Just different types of diseases of the central nervous system, like the cord or the brain. So the first here is called spina bifida. And it's probably the most important one to be familiar with because it affects roughly 1 in 1,000 births, which is actually quite a lot. Now, this is a pretty extreme example that you're seeing here. Most of them are not that extreme. What happens here is the arch of the vertebrae, when the vertebrae is forming in utero, before you're born, the arch doesn't completely close. And so the hole that's inside the vertebrae is now open. You can imagine like a little U shape now of the vertebrae. And the spinal cord, as it's developing within that, pops out of that vertebrae and starts to grow outside the vertebral column. Okay? That's a bad thing, because obviously there's protection with the vertebral column, but now we're not getting that protection here. And so what you're really seeing here in this baby is a lot of the cord that is grown, or various other neurons that have grown outside of that. Now there's ways to correct this both in utero and after birth. But I think it's amazing to actually go inside and actually correct it before the baby's even born now, if they know it early enough. This is one of the reasons, one of the many reasons, that they give you ultrasounds. You can see that. Okay? And they can do corrective actions. This is also the reason, by the way, why they give you prenatal vitamins. Probably the major reason why they give you prenatal vitamins. Now, why are they called prenatal vitamins? Because you take them before you're pregnant. Really? Yeah. So the reason I say that is because the reason why this happens more often than not is from a deficiency in one thing, folic acid. Folic acid. Okay? If you have a deficiency in folic acid, the chances of this happening go up astronomically. But you need that folic acid on board within the first 3 to 4 weeks of pregnancy. Unfortunately, by the time most people find out they're pregnant, it's after they've missed a period, they're already 3 or 4 weeks. So again, if you plan on getting pregnant, take prenatal vitamins so that you can have the folic acid built up before that can occur. Does that make sense? So that's what the doctor always says. If you intend to, take prenatals. They're not that expensive anyway. Okay? Okay, spinal cord trauma, just to give you some examples here. I don't have any pictures here. I'm going to turn the lights. I'm not going to go through all these little individual details, so you don't know if you know flaccid or spastic, but I'm going to describe these. I think this is important for people to have a general awareness of, but I'm not going to expect you guys to study this aspect of it. Spinal cord trauma, people get paralyzed all the time due to transections or cutting or damage that occurs on the cord. Now, because the way the cord is built or designed, you've seen today, you can imagine that if the cord gets cut or damaged down here in the lumbar region, you're really only going to affect things that are below it. And that's what you see. So you can still have control of your arms if you transect your spinal cord right here. Okay? It's where you have the neck injuries that you have complete loss of everything below the neck. That makes sense, right? Everything below that damage is what gets affected. So you have things like paraplegia, quadriplegia, hemiplegia, and paresis, which is just partial numbness or partial inability to feel or control various parts of your body. We call it weakness of the limbs, for example. So it just depends on the damage, is what that really comes down to. The severity of the damage and the location of the damage. But let me go ahead and get into paralysis, because this is something that people don't always think about or aren't always aware of. Some types of paralysis can be caused by infectious agents, meaning bacteria, viruses, or other microorganisms. And these two are commonly causes of what we call flaccid or spastic paralysis. So first off, what is flaccid? Well, that's where all your muscles go weak. You don't have any voluntary muscle control. So we know acetylcholine, right? Acetylcholine binds to the receptors, and that causes muscle contraction. Well, there are toxins that will bind to the acetylcholine receptors, will not activate them, but they will block acetylcholine from binding to the receptors. So you can imagine, for example, if this is the acetylcholine receptor right here, okay, and we have a very specific shape that acetylcholine is going to fit into, right? You can imagine now, I don't know if we have another color, there's going to be a toxin that can go like this, can go into that pocket, and when it's there, it doesn't leave. It stays there and it blocks it. So if it blocks that receptor, it means your muscles cannot contract. You're flaccid. In fact, there's classic pictures that I'm not going to show you in this class, because this is not a micro class, but of babies that are hunched over like this, okay? Because they have something called infant botulism. You ever heard of infant botulism? So it causes flaccid paralysis. So the botulism toxin, yes, the same stuff you inject in your face to make you permanently smiling, right? That same thing binds to those muscles, okay? And can cause, as I said, what they call flaccid paralysis. And that's exactly what it does to your face muscles as well, by the way. It makes it unable to use those muscles for a short period of time. So botulism. The botulism you think of when you eat a can of green beans that has botulism toxin in it, or the botulism from infant botulism. How does that come about? Just in case if you don't know this, I'll tell you. Botulism is caused by a spore. Okay, it's a bacterium that can survive out in the open. Basically, a nice little, small, dried up little bacteria that can survive all kinds of conditions. A lot of things, okay? Including honey. It survives in the dirt, it survives in the pollen, it gets on a bee, it goes into honey, and you eat it. Now we're fine, being adults. We eat honey all the time, okay? The bacterium goes into our stomach and we digest it away. We have a very low pH, we have enzymes, we have all kinds of things that are going to destroy that bacteria. But infants, especially under 1 year of age, do not have a very acidic stomach, nor do they have the acids or enzymes necessary. And so that bacteria survives the stomach, goes into the intestine, and starts to produce toxin in the intestine. And the infant can die if it's not treated right away. So the muscles go flaccid, including the respiratory muscles, breathing, and the heart. The only way to save the child is to introduce antibodies against that toxin. So you can imagine, we're not going to get into this class with that kind of detail, but you can imagine you can have an antibody that would bind to that, and now that complex right here cannot bind to the receptor, and you can save the child that way. So there are what they call antiserum, that are available in case you have a child with botulism. By the way, anybody ever notice, you probably never do anymore, what's it called, cider. It's mostly pasteurized now. You know why? Because when we were kids, meaning people that are close to 40 like me, there would always be a rise in botulism in the fall. Because we used to go to apple orchards and drink cider. And it's the little kids that end up getting more sick than the adults, because again, the spores are on the apples. They go into the cider and we eat them. Fun little tidbits. Spastic paralysis, that's the opposite. So again, the same kind of process here, but now with this toxin being made by this, in this case, a bacteria as well, it now causes the muscles to contract uncontrollably. They're like this. all your muscles are contracting. There are classical pictures of tetanus, lockjaw. You ever heard of lockjaw? Okay, it starts off in the jaw and it spreads throughout the body. And eventually it hits your respiratory and your heart muscles and you die. Same thing. Tetanus. There's a bacteria that is in the soil. If it gets into your skin, into a position that it does not see any oxygen, and that's the key. Okay? It can grow, make a toxin, and then you can have spastic paralysis. But it has to go into a place without oxygen, which is why they say if you step on a nail, go to the doctor. If you scrape your foot on a nail, you don't have to worry about it. Because a scrape, there's oxygen there. But a deep puncture, there's no oxygen there. That's the difference. By the way, if you didn't know this, the tetanus shot or vaccine, all it is, it makes you make antibodies against that toxin. So if you step on a rusty nail, tetanus can grow in your skin, the organism, bacteria, produce all the toxin at once, and you'll never get tetanus because you have the antibodies against it. And that's all they do too if you end up getting tetanus for real. They give you the antibodies to treat it. Just want to mention that, kind of a fun little tidbit about paralysis. Poliomyelitis, this is damage caused by the virus called polio. Probably heard of polio before. When most people think of polio, they think about the lung machines. They think about people that are 50, 60 years old, or even older now, from the 50s, that walk with a limp because they had polio when they were a little girl, a little boy. Now, 99% of the cases of polio are like a flu or a cold. In other words, it's a benign infection. It doesn't do anything. But 1 in 100 end up having muscle issues. It degenerates into, in some cases, even worse, death. You don't have any voluntary control of the respiratory system, the muscles. And you have to be put on special machines to breathe for you. So, I mean, all the details here, but it just causes basically damage to the brain stem. So that's part of the brain. The virus infects part of the brain, and again, not everybody, but in some people, and can lead to issues with the muscle system, along the cord, etc. ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease, is a really complicated disease that I don't understand very well at all. But you see early weakness of the muscles that then degenerates further and further until finally you die of the disease. There is no cure. So they was first diagnosed, or at least became very commonly known by Lou Gehrig, the baseball player. Or right now they call it ALS. It's more of a common name. Shingles is the last thing I'll mention. Just again, kind of a overall thought here. And just out of curiosity, anybody in this room actually had chickenpox? The real thing? Really? Wow, the majority of people.
How about the shingles too?
Really? Wow, okay. Most people, meaning my other class, had the vaccine.
You had a young class.
I did. They are younger, that's for sure. So, the vaccine came out in the 90s. Early 90s, actually. And it's very commonly used now. In fact, my kids have all had it. Back in the day, as you remember, Billy down the road got chickenpox, and we had a big party at Billy's house. That's how it worked, right? Because chickenpox is one of those funny viruses that when you're a kid, it's pretty benign. It causes, obviously pustules on the skin and itching, keeps you out of school for a couple of days, but that's it. It's not life-threatening. Once you're a teenager or older, it can be life-threatening. And so your parents did you a favor by getting you sick from Billy. Go play with Billy some more. You're still not, go play with Billy. Okay? Now again, they have a vaccine for it, so you don't have to play with Billy anymore. It's called chickenpox. But here's the thing. You know the ganglion we talked about? Their ganglion, the cells, the actual soma, the virus lives there. So if you were infected with the real virus, which I think everybody in this class raised their hand, that virus is still in you. The same virus you had when you were 5 years old is still alive in your cells. It's in your ganglion. And hopefully it'll stay there. But there are times in your life, especially times that you are stressed, and I don't mean necessarily mental stress, I mean physical stress, which can be labor. Not all, it doesn't happen very often in child labor, but it can. or when you turn 40 and things start malfunctioning. Stress.
That's so much to look forward to.
Isn't that great? Looking forward. I turned 40 this year, so I'm just thinking of all the wonderful things that are coming my way. But those virus particles can come out, and they go and they migrate down the neurons or down the nerves to the very, very ends, right around here in the trunk, right? And this is where they'll cause pustules along the side of the skin, and we call that shingles. Okay? So shingles is an outbreak of the same virus you had from when you were very, very young. You can get it again and again and again. You can't get chickenpox more than once, not really, but you can get shingles many, many times. You can never get shingles unless you've had chickenpox, though. Which someone who has shingles can give a kid chickenpox. It's the same virus.
So it doesn't happen that way if they've only had the vaccine?
To my knowledge, no, but it's only been 20 years, so they're still looking for it. To my knowledge, and this has been when I was in college, we studied this quite a bit. To my knowledge, there's never been a single case where the vaccine has caused shingles. But it is an attenuated strain that they use, meaning it's a weakened strain, or maybe even heat killed in some cases. So it's a possibility, ever so small, that you could get shingles if you got the vaccine. Yeah.
So if it's obviously better to have the chickenpox as a child, why do they do the vaccine and not just let him get it? And
Well, the vaccine is safer than the disease. So, I mean, the preferred route now is the vaccine. The preferred route in the 60s and 70s and 80s, which some of us are probably,
will that vaccine ever wear off though? As they
I think they do require boosters now. I think they do recommend boosters.
They have to have 2 doses.
That's what I thought. My wife handles all that, I don't know. I tell her, go ahead and do it. We have different responsibilities. But yes, I believe there are boosters required. Just like there's boosters for MMR,
Right.
measles, mumps, rubella. So
Yeah, I think they get, 2 shots for the chickenpox?
they probably do.
Yeah.
And it's probably not a bad idea to get it in college as well, just to be sure. So, it's one of those things, doctors thought for many, many years that you only had to have the measles vaccine when you were a kid, and then measles started popping up in colleges. And then they gave boosters. Well, same thing's now true with whooping cough. Okay? You ever heard of the 100-day cough? Bad. You cough for 100 days, 3 months straight. It sucks. Okay? It's caused by whooping cough, a very mild form of it. We had some vaccination to it, but you can still get this later on. So again, they revaccinate that as well. So that's a common thing. Okay, I talked too much. Okay. It's 8 o'clock. Feel free to take a break.